is BRD2, which is a review and discuss the proposed draft of the superintendent's contract. As we get so okay, and did he do it? Okay. Our first item is I recommend the board review and discuss the proposed draft employment agreement for the new superintendent. Is there a motion? No. Motion by Mrs. McQuinn, second by Mrs. Whitfield. Discussion. The purpose of this is, as we said, and I'll turn it over to Mrs. Rico, is for us to give any input we need. Mr. Barbieri was designated to work with Ms. Rico on the negotiations, and I think there are a couple provisions in the draft contract that are not even necessary now because of that. So any comments and questions? And if you got a suggestion, make that as a suggestion, or Ms. Rico, how do you want us to handle that?
Well, thank you so much. And first of all, Mr. Barbieri and Mr. Littlejohn, I think, worked pretty closely on the detail of this. And it might be appropriate at the board's pleasure to have Mr. Littlejohn or Mr. Barbieri go through a couple of the key points, unless you all have read it and want to dive in. But it might be a good idea to just kind of walk through some of the key points of the contract. And unless you all just have already read it and want to give us direction, we just move forward and come back next week. My assumption is you want us to come back next week with a contract ready to sign.
Mrs. Brill.
Thank you, and I did read it, and even though I was going to suggest one word change, which really isn't necessary, but I still think we should keep it in there, and it was at line 66. It's talking about the superintendent within 6 months of the beginning of the term would establish a residence. I think it's still good to keep it in there so we have it in there, but I was going to suggest changing the word personal residence to primary residence. And that was my big suggestion.
We can probably deal with that in the next week. So, Blair, any comments on anything you think we need to deal with? I think the salary issue is going to be negotiated, and some of the others. So, Blair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, board members. The highlighted provisions that show up if you get black and white copies in the shading are the provisions that, as Mr. Barbieri and I worked through it, we wanted the board to pay special attention to. These represent his thoughts and my thoughts kind of collectively about how to make this into a contract for somebody who is already an employee of the district. So issues like what Mrs. Brill just mentioned on the residence thing, that's certainly fine from my perspective to change that from personal to primary, and probably makes sense in this context. But I'm happy to walk through each of the highlighted provisions at the pleasure of the board if you want me to, or field any questions that you have, whatever you like.
What's the pleasure? Dr. Robinson said, briefly walk through the highlighted areas.
Sure.
Briefly.
Okay. All right.
5 seconds per item.
Okay. I'm working off of. I'll work off the clean draft because I think it's a little easier to read. So, paragraph 1.2 that starts on line 20. We had talked about, Mr. Barbieri and I had talked about the superintendent getting a automatic 1-year extension provided he got a highly effective rating at his annual review, and that would begin in the first review in the fall of 2019. So it would be, for the rest of his work, the rest of this academic year, and then all of the 18-19 year. And then if it's effective or less, that it would be up to the board's discretion as to whether or not to grant an extension of that year contract at the time that the review was done. So that's that was our best collective thinking about where the board ought to be, but happy to entertain changes to that.
Right. I think that, go ahead,
Okay?
as brief as possible.
Okay.
Would you, Blair, I think Blair has the detail if you need some fine tuning, but let me just kind of sum up all of the, if you wish, all of the additional compensation package type things like the additional FRS, et cetera, that was sort of unique to Dr. Avosa having moved here and trying to reconnect with his FRS situation has been eliminated. So I think all of those things will go back to being a standard. We followed the statutory provision for vacation time, sick days, et cetera. And I think that the last, jumping down to sort of the last provisions with respect to termination or resignation of the agreement would address the issue of requiring 180 days notice to the board, but the board being able to, in its discretion, cut that short after 30 days so that it would be up to the board to utilize the entire 6-month period with a superintendent that had given notice to resign, or cut that short at your discretion. So I think those are pretty much the highlights.
Yes.
Right.
And what about the expense account and car? Is that's still in there?
Those are still the same as they were in Dr. Avosa's contract.
Right. And again, those will all be discussed in that. Mr. Barbieri.
Mr. Shaw, in Dr. Vosa's contract, and Blair and I left it blank, but he was to get $1,000 per month. I left that blank, so because we didn't have any input. We know what the salary, we advertised $250 to $300, but we never talked about the monthly. So if you could give some guidance so that when we meet with Dr. Fenoy, we have some thoughts from all of you as to.
Ms. Rico, with that amount of money, what are the restrictions of what the superintendent can do with that? Are there any?
It was for, Blair would have the detail on the exact language. It was for business-related expenses such as, community engagements, et cetera.
But Mrs. Rico, there's no requirement for him to
For
give us any
receipt.
receipts.
Right.
So
Right.
it's just a flat amount we give him without him having to
Right.
document.
Okay. Well, I suggest, why don't we give Mr. Barbieri the authority for the same amount, and then we can, if there's something that comes up, they can negotiate that. That okay with everybody? Okay. Yeah.
I'm sorry. So $1,000, but the negotiation wouldn't be going down, it would be going up.
It wouldn't go
So-
up.
Okay,
Since you
so,
already spilled your guts on the front of the television.
so the cap is $1,000.
Too late to take it back, I guess. Okay.
Okay,
So,
I guess there's
all
no,
right.
Mrs. Andrews just said, but she wants receipts. I mean, does the rest of the board want receipts on what he spends the money on, or are we just giving him a flat? Mr. Burke is shaking his head over there, Mr. Shaw.
Just from a practicality standpoint, with the previous superintendent, we include the business expenses as part of the payroll process. If you add the receipt requirement, it becomes a much more cumbersome reimbursement type approach.
And if it's part of the payroll, then it's also taxable, I believe, right?
I believe so. Yes, sir.
And the new tax law, I think, eliminates business expenses, but that's something I'm not sure we can get into right now. Any other questions? If not, we'll call a question. Everybody in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed, same sign. Motion carries 7-0, I assume. Mrs. Rico.
the one, a big blank, is start date. So would you like to give some direction on that?
Well, can we deal with that when we get to the issue with the superintendent's exit date? All right, that okay with everybody? All right, the next item is BRD2, and I recommend that Mr. Barbieri be designated to do the final negotiations